In the remote valleys of Colorado's high country, where the nearest neighbor is 10 miles away and the silence can be either peaceful or overwhelming, life moves at a different pace. For some, this isolation provides the space to heal. For others, it becomes a prison where dark thoughts can grow unchecked. This is the story of Daniel Rivers, a man who had retreated to the mountains to escape his own pain, and Sofia Martinez, a young woman whose despair had brought her to the edge of an irreversible decision. When their paths crossed on a cold October morning, neither could have predicted how profoundly they would change each other's understanding of hope, healing, and the reason to keep fighting when everything seems lost. Sometimes salvation comes not from grand gestures or professional intervention, but from one human being simply refusing to let another give up. Sometimes the act of saving someone else becomes the very thing that saves us too. Before we dive into this powerful story of redemption and second chances, let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We love connecting with our viewers from around the world. Daniel Rivers had been riding the fence line of his remote Colorado ranch for over an hour when he first noticed something unusual in the grove of aspens that marked the eastern boundary of his property. The October morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant blue sky that made the golden aspen leaves seem to glow against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks. It should have been beautiful, peaceful even, but something in the shadows between the trees caught his attention and sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. At 43, Daniel had been living alone on his 1,000-acre ranch for 5 years, ever since his wife Catherine died in a climbing accident and his world collapsed around him. The isolation that had once felt like healing now often felt like punishment, but it was a punishment he'd convinced himself he deserved. He'd failed to save the person who mattered most to him, and the guilt had driven him to seek solitude in these mountains where his mistakes couldn't hurt anyone else. His horse, a steady quarter horse named Thunder, snorted and shied away from the grove, ears pinned back in obvious distress. Animals, Daniel had learned, often sensed things before humans did, and Thunder's behavior immediately put him on high alert. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, dismounting and approaching the trees on foot. "What's got you spooked?" "Dre." As he pushed through the golden aspen leaves, Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Hanging from a sturdy branch about 8 feet off the ground was a young woman, maybe 25 years old, suspended by a makeshift noose fashioned from what looked like a torn bedsheet. Her feet dangled just inches above a kicked-over wooden crate that had obviously been used as a makeshift platform. But she was still breathing. Daniel's military training from his tour in Afghanistan kicked in immediately, overriding the shock and horror of the scene. He'd seen enough trauma to know that seconds could mean the difference between life and death, and this woman was still alive, though barely conscious and clearly in distress. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm going to get you down." Moving with practiced efficiency, Daniel grabbed the wooden crate and positioned it beneath her feet, then climbed up and carefully supported her weight while working to loosen the makeshift noose around her neck. The sheet had tightened considerably under her weight, and her face was flushed and swollen, but she was still breathing, still fighting on some level. "Come on, stay with me," Daniel said, as he finally managed to free the noose and carefully lowered her to the ground. The woman was unconscious now, her breathing shallow but steady, and Daniel could see angry red marks around her neck where the sheet had cut into her skin. He checked her pulse, weak but present, and then carefully examined her for other injuries. She was thin, almost gaunt, wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. Her dark hair was tangled and unwashed, and there were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion and despair that went far deeper than physical fatigue. But she was alive, and that was what mattered. Daniel carefully lifted the woman in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her to where Thunder waited nervously at the edge of the grove. Getting both of them onto the horse was challenging, but Daniel had handled more difficult evacuations during his military service. Within minutes, he was riding hard toward his ranch house, the unconscious woman cradled against his chest. The ride back to the house felt like it took forever. Though Daniel knew it was only about 15 minutes, every few seconds he checked to make sure she was still breathing, terrified that he might have been too late, that whatever had driven her to that grove might still claim her despite his intervention. When they reached the ranch house, Daniel carried her inside and laid her gently on the couch in his living room. He grabbed his first aid kit and began treating the rope burns on her neck, cleaning and bandaging the wounds with the careful precision he'd learned as a combat medic. Her breathing seemed to be getting stronger and some color was returning to her face, but she remained unconscious. Daniel knew he should call 911, get her to a hospital where professionals could evaluate her condition and provide proper psychological care. But something held him back. Maybe it was the remoteness of his location, where an ambulance would take at least an hour to arrive. Or maybe it was a deeper instinct that told him this woman needed something more than institutional care. As he worked to make her comfortable, Daniel found himself studying her face. Even in unconsciousness, even marked by whatever pain had driven her to such desperation, there was something striking about her features. She had high cheekbones and olive skin that suggested Hispanic heritage, and there was a strength in her face that seemed at odds with the vulnerability of her current situation. Around noon, she began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, beautiful dark brown eyes that immediately filled with confusion and then with what looked like disappointment when she realized where she was. "Where?" she began, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "You're safe," Daniel said gently, moving into her line of sight but being careful not to crowd her. "You're at my ranch. I'm Daniel. I found you in the grove and brought you here." The woman, girl really, she looked so young lying there, stared at him for a long moment, processing this information. Then her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you stop me?" It was the question Daniel had been dreading, but also the one he'd been expecting. How do you explain to someone who has given up all hope that their life is worth saving? How do you convince someone that their pain, however overwhelming, doesn't have to be permanent? "Because," Daniel said quietly, settling into the chair beside the couch, "whatever brought you to that place, whatever pain you're carrying, it doesn't have to end this way. There are other options, other paths forward." "You don't know anything about me," she said, but there was no anger in her voice, just exhaustion. "You don't know what I've done, what I've lost." "You're right, I don't," Daniel admitted, "but I know that everyone deserves a chance to find their way back from the darkness. And I know that sometimes we need help to see that there's still light ahead." The woman closed her eyes, and for a moment Daniel thought she might have fallen asleep again, but then she spoke, so quietly he had to lean forward to hear her. "My name is Sophia," she said, "Sophia Martinez, and I don't know how to keep going anymore." Daniel felt something shift in his chest, not just sympathy, but recognition. He saw in Sophia's eyes the same hopelessness he'd carried for years after Catherine's death, the same conviction that life had become too painful to endure. "Sophia," he said, "I'm glad to meet you, and I'm glad you're here, even if you're not sure you are right now." As the afternoon wore on, Daniel made tea and soup, coaxing Sophia to take small sips and trying to keep her engaged in gentle conversation. She didn't volunteer much information about what had brought her to his ranch or to that desperate moment in the grove, but she didn't ask to leave either. When evening approached and Sophia was resting again, Daniel sat in his kitchen and stared out at the mountains, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. He'd saved her life. That much was clear. But what happened next? He couldn't keep her prisoner, but he also couldn't let her walk back into whatever darkness had nearly claimed her. For the first time in years, Daniel Rivers found himself responsible for someone other than himself. It was terrifying and overwhelming, but it was also something else. It was purpose. Maybe, just maybe, helping Sophia find her way back to the light would help him find his own way out of the shadows he'd been living in since Catherine died. Breaking through the walls. 3 days had passed since Daniel found Sophia in the aspen grove, and the routine they'd developed felt both fragile and essential. Sophia spent most of her time sleeping on the couch in his living room, waking periodically to accept small amounts of food and drink before retreating back into the protective cocoon of unconsciousness. Daniel found himself moving quietly through his own house, hyper-aware of her presence and constantly checking to make sure she was still breathing. On the 4th morning, he woke to find the couch empty. Panic shot through him as he searched the house, calling her name softly, afraid of what he might find or not find. He discovered her sitting on the back porch, wrapped in one of his old blankets, staring out at the mountains as the sunrise painted the peaks in shades of gold and pink. "I thought you might have," Daniel began, then stopped himself before finishing the sentence. "Left?" Sophia asked without turning around. "I thought about it, but I don't have anywhere to go." Daniel settled into the chair beside her, relieved but also concerned about the flatness in her voice. Over the past few days, he'd seen glimpses of the person Sophia might be underneath all the pain. Moments when she'd smiled slightly at something he said, or when her eyes had shown interest in the horses grazing in the pasture. But this morning, she seemed to have retreated back into the numbness that had nearly claimed her life. "Want to talk about what brought you here?" Daniel asked gently. Sophia was quiet for so long that Daniel thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, slowly, she began to speak. "I was a teacher," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "3rd grade, in a little school in Pueblo. I loved those kids, loved seeing them learn and grow and discover new things about the world." Daniel waited patiently, sensing that this was the first time Sophia had talked about her past since her arrival. "There was this boy, Miguel, 8 years old, sweetest kid you ever met, but he came from a really difficult home situation. His father was violent. Miguel would come to school with bruises, making excuses, but I knew. Everyone knew." Sophia's hands were trembling now, and Daniel resisted the urge to reach out and comfort her, sensing that she needed to get this story out. "I reported it, multiple times, to the principal, to child services, to anyone who would listen, but nothing happened. The system moved too slowly. There wasn't enough evidence. The father was careful not to leave marks where they would show, and Miguel kept coming to school, getting quieter and more withdrawn every day." Daniel felt his stomach tighten, already anticipating where this story was heading. "One Monday morning, Miguel didn't come to school. I called his house and his mother said he was sick. But something in her voice. I drove to their house after school, just to check on him." Sophia's voice broke, and tears began streaming down her face. "I found him in the hospital. His father had beaten him so badly that he was in a coma. 8 years old, and this tiny little boy was fighting for his life because the system I trusted, the system I believed would protect him, had failed completely." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Sophia's guilt and grief as if it were his own. "Miguel died 3 days later, never woke up, and I couldn't function anymore. I blamed myself for not doing more, for not somehow forcing the system to act faster. I couldn't go back to the classroom, couldn't look at other children without seeing Miguel's face. I lost my job, my apartment, my sense of who I was supposed to be." "Sophia," Daniel said quietly, "that wasn't your fault. You did everything you could within a broken system." "Did I?" she asked, finally turning to look at him. "Because I keep thinking about all the things I didn't try. I could have confronted the father directly, could have taken Miguel home with me, could have made more noise, caused more trouble. Maybe if I'd been willing to break the rules." Daniel recognized the endless cycle of self-recrimination, the way grief and guilt could twist a person's thinking until they became convinced that they were responsible for tragedies beyond their control. He'd lived in that same mental prison for years after Catherine's death. "You know what I think," Daniel said. "I think you cared so much about that little boy that you've convinced yourself his death was your failure rather than the failure of every adult who should have protected him but didn't. You've taken on guilt that belongs to his father, to the social workers who didn't act fast enough, to a system that prioritizes procedure over protection. Sophia stared at him, and for the first time since her arrival, Daniel saw something other than despair in her eyes. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was engagement, as if she was actually considering what he'd said, rather than simply enduring his presence. "How do you know?" she asked. "How do you know what it's like to carry that kind of guilt?" Daniel had been dreading this question, but he'd also known it was coming. If he wanted Sophia to trust him enough to heal, he had to be willing to share his own darkness. "Because I lost someone too," he said. "My wife, Catherine. She died in a climbing accident 5 years ago, and I was supposed to be there. I was supposed to be her climbing partner that day. But I had work I couldn't leave, business meetings that seemed important at the time." Daniel's throat tightened as he continued. "She went with a friend instead, someone less experienced than me, someone who made a mistake that I wouldn't have made. When the rope failed and Catherine fell, I knew it was my fault. If I'd been there, if I'd prioritized her safety over a meeting about cattle futures, she'd still be alive." Sophia was listening intently now, and Daniel could see recognition in her eyes. The recognition of someone who understood what it meant to be haunted by what-ifs and if-onlys. "I came up here to get away from everything that reminded me of her, of us, of the life we'd built together. I told myself I was healing, but really I was just hiding, punishing myself by cutting off all connection to anything that mattered." "And you think that's what I'm doing?" Sophia asked. "I think you're in so much pain that death seemed like the only way to make it stop. But pain isn't permanent, Sophia. It changes, it evolves, and eventually it can transform into something else. Purpose, compassion, strength, but only if you give it time." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun climb higher and listening to the wind in the aspen trees. Finally, Sophia spoke again. "What changed for you? What made you decide to keep going?" Daniel smiled sadly. "I haven't decided that yet. Not completely, but finding you, having someone to take care of besides myself, it's reminded me that isolation isn't healing. It's just another kind of death." Sophia pulled the blanket tighter around herself and looked out at the horses grazing in the distance. "Those are beautiful horses," she said. "You want to meet them?" For the first time since her arrival, Sophia nodded with something that might have been enthusiasm. "I've never been around horses before." Daniel stood and extended his hand to help her up. "Then let's change that." As they walked toward the pasture together, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the sense that he was moving forward rather than just marking time. Helping Sophia take these small steps toward engagement with life was helping him remember why life was worth living. It wasn't healing exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of healing for both of them. Finding purpose in pain. 2 weeks had passed since Sophia's arrival at the ranch, and the transformation was subtle but unmistakable. She no longer spent entire days sleeping on the couch. Instead, she had begun following Daniel through his daily routines, helping with small tasks around the ranch, and asking questions about everything from cattle management to the identification of local wildlife. The deep despair that had nearly claimed her life was still there, but it was no longer consuming her every waking moment. On this particular morning, Daniel found Sophia in the barn, gently brushing one of his horses, a gentle mare named Luna, who had taken an immediate liking to the young woman. Sophia's movements were careful and methodical, and there was something peaceful in her expression that Daniel hadn't seen before. "You're getting good at that," Daniel observed, leaning against the stall door. "Luna makes it easy," Sophia replied, running the brush along the mare's neck. "She's so patient with me, even when I do things wrong." "Animals have a way of accepting us exactly as we are," Daniel said. "No judgment, no expectations beyond basic kindness." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about pain transforming into purpose. I'm starting to understand what you meant." "How so?" Sophia set down the brush and turned to face him. When I was teaching, I thought my purpose was to help children learn reading and math and science. But maybe my real purpose was to be someone who truly saw them, who noticed when they were hurting and tried to do something about it. That sounds like a pretty important purpose to me. But I failed at it, Sophia said, though there was less self-condemnation in her voice than there had been 2 weeks earlier. With Miguel, when it mattered most, I failed. Daniel stepped into the stall and leaned against the opposite wall. Can I tell you what I see when I look at you? Sophia nodded, though her expression was guarded. I see someone who cared so deeply about a vulnerable child that she was willing to fight a broken system to protect him. I see someone who reported abuse multiple times, despite knowing it might make her own job more difficult. I see someone who lost everything rather than compromise her principles or stop advocating for kids who needed her voice. Daniel paused, making sure Sophia was really listening. That's not failure, Sophia. That's heroism. The fact that the system failed Miguel doesn't diminish the courage you showed in fighting for him. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the despairing tears Daniel had seen so often over the past 2 weeks. These tears seemed different, cleaner somehow, like rain washing away dust. I miss them, she said quietly. All of those kids. I wonder what happened to them after I left. Whether anyone else is looking out for them the way I tried to. What if you could go back to that work? Daniel asked. Not necessarily teaching in a traditional classroom, but finding other ways to help vulnerable children. I don't know if I'm strong enough for that anymore. Sophia, you survived losing everything that mattered to you, lived through despair so complete that you were ready to end your life. And now you're standing here taking care of horses and thinking about other people's welfare. If that's not strength, I don't know what is. That afternoon, Daniel suggested they drive into the nearby town of Cascade Falls to pick up supplies. It would be Sophia's first venture beyond the ranch since her arrival, and Daniel wasn't sure how she would handle being around other people again. But she agreed, though he could see the anxiety in her eyes as they climbed into his pickup truck. Cascade Falls was a small mountain community with a main street lined with local businesses and a population that knew everyone's business within hours of anything happening. Daniel was prepared for curious looks and whispered conversations about his mysterious houseguest, but he was surprised by how naturally Sophia handled the attention. At the hardware store, she struck up a conversation with the elderly owner about the best way to treat rope burn. Apparently, she'd been researching her own injuries and had questions about healing and scarring. At the grocery store, she helped an overwhelmed mother wrangle 2 toddlers while the woman tried to manage her shopping list. You're good with kids, Daniel observed as they loaded groceries into the truck. It's what I know, Sophia replied, what I'm trained for. Even after everything that happened, it still feels natural. On the drive back to the ranch, Sophia was quieter than usual, staring out at the mountain landscape with a thoughtful expression. Daniel, she said finally, can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you really bring me to your house instead of taking me straight to a hospital? You could have called 911, let the professionals handle my situation. Daniel had been expecting this question for 2 weeks, and he still wasn't sure he had a good answer. Honestly, I think it was instinct more than logic. You were alive, you were breathing, and something told me that what you needed wasn't medical intervention so much as human connection, a place to be safe while you figured out whether you wanted to keep living. And if I had decided I didn't want to keep living, Daniel pulled over to the side of the road and turned to look at her directly. Then I would have respected that decision, eventually, but I would have made sure you had time to make it clearly without the fog of immediate crisis and despair. I would have made sure you knew that someone cared about what happened to you. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Do you know what convinced me to stay that first morning when I thought about leaving? What? It was watching you with the horses. The way you talked to them, the patience you showed, the obvious care you put into taking care of them. I thought, if this man can show this much compassion to animals, maybe he can help me remember what it feels like to be worth caring about. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. Sophia, you were always worth caring about. You just forgot for a while. I'm starting to remember, she said quietly. And I think I want to figure out how to help other people remember too. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sophia brought up something that had clearly been on her mind all day. I've been thinking about what you said about finding new ways to help vulnerable children. What if there was a way to do that work without going back into the traditional school system? What did you have in mind? I don't know exactly. Maybe working with kids who've been through trauma or families in crisis. Something where I could make a real difference without being constrained by bureaucracy and politics. Daniel smiled. That sounds like the beginning of a plan. It's scary, Sophia admitted. The idea of putting myself back out there, of caring that much again. The best purposes usually are scary, Daniel said. If it wasn't important enough to frighten you, it probably wouldn't be worth doing. As they prepared to go inside for the night, Sophia turned to Daniel with an expression of gratitude mixed with determination. Thank you, she said, for finding me, for saving me, for giving me time to remember who I am underneath all the pain. Thank you for letting me help, Daniel replied, for reminding me that isolation isn't healing, and that sometimes the best way to save yourself is to save someone else. Neither of them was fully healed yet. That kind of recovery took time, probably years. But they were both moving forward now, step by careful step, and that forward motion felt like the most important victory either of them had achieved in a long time. The road back to life. 6 months after that October morning, when Daniel found Sophia in the aspen grove, the ranch had transformed from a place of solitary retreat into something resembling a home. The changes were everywhere. Fresh flowers on the kitchen table, laughter echoing from the barn where Sophia worked with the horses, and most importantly, the sense of purpose that had returned to both their lives. Sophia had not only survived, but had begun to thrive in ways that surprised even her. The fragile young woman who had nearly given up on life had evolved into someone with clear goals and the determination to achieve them. She had enrolled in online courses to become a certified trauma counselor, specializing in children who had experienced abuse or neglect. The coursework was challenging and emotionally demanding, but Sophia approached it with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. I got my first certification today, she announced, bursting into the house with a grin that Daniel had rarely seen but had grown to treasure. I'm officially qualified to provide crisis intervention counseling. Daniel looked up from the ranch financial reports he'd been reviewing, work that had become much more manageable since Sophia had offered to help organize his bookkeeping system with the same methodical precision she'd once brought to lesson planning. That's incredible, Sophia. How does it feel? Terrifying and exciting and right, all at the same time, she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. My supervisor says there's a position opening up at the Children's Advocacy Center in Colorado Springs. It would mean working directly with kids who've been removed from dangerous situations, helping them process trauma and develop coping strategies. Daniel felt a complex mix of emotions, pride in Sophia's accomplishments, excitement about her future prospects, and a selfish disappointment at the thought of her leaving the ranch that had become their shared sanctuary. That sounds like exactly the kind of work you were meant to do, he said, and meant it despite his personal reservations. The thing is, Sophia continued, it would also mean leaving here, leaving you, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Daniel studied her face, noting the confidence that had replaced the haunted look she'd carried when she first arrived. Sophia had grown stronger over the past months, but she'd also become an integral part of his life in ways he was still learning to understand. Sophia, you can't base major career decisions on what's comfortable for me. You have to follow your path, wherever it leads. What if my path doesn't have to lead away from here? She asked. What if there was a way to do this work from right here in the mountains? Daniel raised an eyebrow. What do you have in mind? B. Sophia pulled out a folder she'd been carrying and spread several documents across his desk. I've been researching the possibility of starting a residential program for children aging out of foster care. Kids who are 18 or 19. Legally adults but with no family support system, no life skills, no real preparation for independence. Daniel examined the papers, program proposals, funding possibilities, statistics about foster care outcomes that were both sobering and heartbreaking. The idea would be to create a working ranch program where these young people could live for 6 months to a year while they develop job skills, life skills, and emotional stability. They'd work with the horses, learn about agriculture and land management, but they'd also get counseling, educational support, and help transitioning to independent living. That's ambitious, Daniel said, though he could feel excitement building as he absorbed the scope of Sophia's vision. It would require converting some of the ranch buildings into dormitories, hiring additional staff, getting licensed as a residential facility. It wouldn't be easy or cheap, Sophia admitted. But Daniel, we have everything these kids need: space, privacy, meaningful work, and 2 adults who understand what it's like to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. Daniel looked up from the papers to study Sophia's face. Her eyes were bright, with the kind of passionate intensity he remembered from her descriptions of teaching. But there was something else there too, a sense of peace and rightness that suggested she'd found her true calling. "You've really thought this through," he said. "I've thought about little else for the past month. And Daniel, I know it's a huge decision that would affect your life as much as mine. If you're not interested, I understand completely. But if you are, if I am, then we'd be partners in this venture. In every sense of the word. Business partners, certainly. But also, Daniel, over these past months, you've become my closest friend, my mentor, my anchor. When the world felt like it was spinning out of control, I can't imagine doing this work with anyone else." Daniel felt his heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with business partnerships and everything to do with the realization that somewhere along the way his feelings for Sophia had evolved far beyond simple concern for her welfare. "Sophia, there's something I need to tell you," he said carefully. "Something I've been afraid to say because I don't want to complicate your recovery or make you feel pressured in any way." Sophia's expression grew serious. "What is it?" "These past 6 months, watching you heal and grow and discover your strength. It's been the most meaningful time I've had since Catherine died. You've brought life back to this place, but more than that, you've brought life back to me. I care about you, not just as someone I helped through a crisis, but as someone I love." The words hung in the air between them, and Daniel immediately began to worry that he'd said too much, too soon. But Sophia's face broke into a smile that was radiant and unguarded. "Daniel, I was hoping you felt the same way. These months with you have shown me what it means to be truly safe with another person, to be accepted completely for who I am, including all the broken parts. I love you too, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather build this new life with." 6 weeks later, the first 3 residents of the Rivers Ranch Youth Transition Program arrived. 2 young men and 1 young woman, all 18 years old, all carrying the kind of damage that came from growing up in systems that were supposed to protect them, but had often failed to do so. Daniel and Sophia had worked tirelessly to prepare for their arrival, converting the ranch's old bunkhouse into comfortable living quarters, developing curricula that combined practical skills with emotional support, and creating an environment that felt more like family than institution. "Welcome to your new home," Sophia said, as she introduced the 3 young people to the horses, the land, and the endless possibilities that stretched before them. "You're going to work hard here, you're going to be challenged, and some days you're going to wonder why you came, but you're also going to discover things about yourselves that you never knew were there." Daniel watched from the porch as Sophia led the group toward the barn, noting how naturally she commanded their attention and respect. The broken young woman he'd found hanging from a tree had transformed into someone whose strength and compassion would now help other broken souls find their way back to wholeness. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset after successfully navigating their first day as directors of a residential program, Sophia leaned against Daniel's shoulder with a contentment that felt both hard-earned and infinitely precious. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't found me that morning?" she asked. "Every day," Daniel replied honestly, "but not with regret, with gratitude. Finding you, helping you heal, building this life together, it's given meaning to everything that came before, even the pain. I used to think that surviving meant just getting through each day without giving up," Sophia said. "Now I know that surviving means finding ways to transform your pain into something that helps other people heal." Daniel kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and marveling at how completely his life had changed since that desperate October morning. "We're going to help a lot of kids," he said. "We already are," Sophia replied, gesturing toward the bunkhouse where their first residents were settling into what might be the first stable home they'd ever known. As the stars began to appear in the vast Colorado sky, Daniel reflected on the strange paths that had brought them both to this moment. Sophia's near suicide had been the darkest moment of her life, but it had also been the beginning of everything beautiful that followed. His isolation had been a form of slow death, but it had prepared him to offer sanctuary to someone who needed it desperately. Sometimes salvation came not through avoiding pain, but through walking straight through it and discovering what waited on the other side. Sometimes the act of saving someone else became the very thing that saved you too. The lonely rancher had indeed found a young woman hanging from a tree, and in giving her a second chance, he had given himself one as well. Together, they were building something that honored both their losses and their healing, a place where broken people could come to remember that life, however painful, was still worth living. This powerful story of Daniel and Sophia reminds us that our darkest moments can become the foundation for our greatest purpose. Their journey shows us that healing isn't just about surviving pain, but about transforming it into something that helps others find hope. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more inspiring stories about resilience and redemption. Let us know in the comments what city you're watching from and share how someone's compassion has made a difference in your life. Remember, we all have the power to be someone's reason to keep going when they can't find one themselves. Until next time, never underestimate the impact of simple human kindness in someone's darkest hour.